During dinner, my son-in-law threw a glass at me. He woke up in jail, then lost his wife. Amid the clink of crystal glasses in his penthouse overlooking Manhattan, Judge Sterling's celebratory dinner had turned into a no-conviction trial. The defendant was his daughter's future. His son-in-law, Julian, raised his glass of Dom Perignon. He looked at no one but his own reflection in the window. "Father," he said, the word a slur, "your world is built on old laws. My world is built on money. Which do you think has the power in the end?" His daughter Olivia blanched. "Julian, stop it!" But Judge Sterling only put down his knife and fork slowly, the sound echoing in the deadly silence. He looked straight into Julian's eyes, his voice cold as ice. "Money can buy the best lawyer, Julian, but it can't buy innocence." I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you? And where are you listening? The view from Judge Sterling's penthouse was, objectively speaking, obscene. It was a view that wealth bought but couldn't invent. A sprawling, glittering panorama of Manhattan that rendered the city silent and perfect, like a snow globe. Tonight, the lights of Central Park South twinkled like a fallen constellation, framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining room. It was a view designed to communicate power, permanence, and the quiet satisfaction of having arrived at the very top. The judge, a man who had spent 40 years on the bench, dissecting human folly, appreciated the silence most of all. The table was set with a kind of meticulous precision that signaled a world far removed from everyday concerns. Heavy Christoffel silverware rested on starched linen, wine, a deep, brooding Bordeaux, breathed in delicate Riedel glasses. A private chef, a man with a Michelin star and the hushed reverence of a mortician, moved silently in the background. It was a scene of celebration. His son-in-law, Julian, had just closed another spectacular quarter for his hedge fund, a feat of financial wizardry that involved algorithms and market predictions the judge neither understood nor trusted. But it was success, and success was to be acknowledged and assessed. The judge watched his daughter, Olivia. She was radiant in a simple, severe black dress that probably cost more than his first car. Her smile, however, was a little too bright, a performance for an audience of one, her father. She was trying so hard to bridge the two worlds. She now inhabited the old mahogany panel world of her father's chambers, built on precedent and principle, and the new glass and chrome world of her husband, built on disruption and audacious risk. She was the fulcrum, and the judge could feel the strain in her posture. In the careful way, she angled her body between the two men. Then Julian stood up, and the carefully constructed equilibrium of the evening tilted. He was wearing a Tom Ford suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin, one designed to project effortless dominance. He picked up his champagne flute, a baccarat crystal holding a bubbling stream of Dom Perignon, but he didn't look at the judge, the host, and patriarch. He didn't even look at his wife. He turned slightly and looked at his own reflection in the vast window, a silhouette superimposed against the billion-dollar backdrop of New York City. The city, it seemed, was the only peer he was willing to acknowledge. "I'd like to propose a toast," Julian said. His voice, like everything about him, was polished, resonant, and filled the room with an easy authority. The judge remained seated, his hands resting on the table, his expression one of neutral, judicial observation. He's seen countless men like Julian in his courtroom, charming, eloquent, and utterly convinced of their own narrative. "Not just to another successful fund," Julian continued, his gaze still fixed on the window, on himself, but to a new era. An era where risk is rewarded, where fortunes are forged not by caution but by conviction. An era where the old rules are, well, they're meant to be broken. That's how progress happens, isn't it? A chill, subtle as a draft from a poorly sealed window, entered the room. The judge felt it on his skin. He saw Olivia's smile falter for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in her perfect facade. Julian finally turned from his reflection. his charismatic smile landing on his wife. It was a conqueror's smile. "To the future," he declared, raising his glass higher, "and to those of us bold enough to seize it rather than just guarding the past." Well, why? The words hung in the air, shimmering with unspoken meaning. Guarding the past. Not honoring it, not building on it, guarding it. As if a lifetime spent upholding the scaffolding of society was nothing more than the work of a dusty museum curator, a night watchman pacing empty halls. To anyone else, it might have sounded like the boilerplate rhetoric of a young, ambitious man. To Judge Sterling, it was a finely crafted projectile aimed directly at the heart of his legacy. He didn't just hear the words. He saw the intent behind them, clear as a signed confession. This wasn't a toast. It was a declaration of obsolescence. He picked up his own glass, the crystal cool against his fingertips. He looked at Julian, really looked at him, past the suit and the smile and the carefully cultivated charm. He saw the cold, glittering ambition in his eyes, the restless hunger for more, always more. It was an appetite the judge recognized. The defendants who stood before him were often driven by the same engine. Only they lacked Julian's polish and his Ivy League vocabulary. "To the future," the judge said, his voice even, betraying nothing. He took a small, deliberate sip. The champagne was exquisite, but it tasted like ash in his mouth. Olivia, sensing the sudden drop in temperature, rushed to fill the silence. "Daddy, that reminds me. I was reading about the closing arguments in the old Whitman case the other day. The transcript was brilliant. You said that justice is just a matter of who has the better story," Julian cut in, waving his hand dismissively as he sat down. He wasn't being rude, not overtly. He was just moving on. The past was past. It held no interest. He leaned forward, his eyes alight with a genuine, predatory excitement. "Speaking of stories, you won't believe the pitch I heard today. A company using predictive AI to map genetic markers for elite athletic performance. We're talking about creating super athletes from birth. Imagine the valuation. We're getting in on the seed round. It's about seeing where the world is going, not where it's been." He said it all with such dazzling confidence, such unshakable belief in his own vision that it was almost hypnotic. Olivia was caught in the beam of it, her face a mixture of admiration for her husband and a flicker of pained apology for her father. She was trying to love them both, to hold two opposing ideologies together through the sheer force of her will. The judge saw it all. He saw the fault line running directly through his daughter's heart. The private chef appeared to clear the plates, his movements a silent ballet of professional discretion. The conversation moved on, but the crack remained, a fine hairline fracture in the polished surface of the evening. Judge Sterling looked at his son-in-law, who was now explaining the genius of disrupting the archaic sports industry. He smiled and nodded, the picture of a proud father-in-law, but inside, his mind was cold and clear, the gears turning with a familiar, grim precision. He wasn't at a celebratory dinner anymore. He was on the bench, and a very compelling, very dangerous defendant was making his case. A man who believed rules were merely suggestions, and the past was a prison to be escaped. And the judge thought, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, this will not end well. After dinner, the judge led them not to the sprawling, minimalist living area, but to his library. It was the heart of the apartment, a room that felt like it had been transplanted from a different century. Oak panels, stained the color of dark honey, lined the walls from floor to ceiling, interrupted only by shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound law books. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint, peaty aroma of the single malt scotch the judge favored. This room was a physical manifestation of his life's work, a fortress of logic, precedent, and the accumulated wisdom of the ages. It was a space that embodied a certain kind of power, the quiet, unshakable power of institutions, of order itself. The judge moved to a small, polished bar cart in the corner. Without asking, he took out two heavy crystal tumblers. He poured a generous measure of Lagavulin 16 into each, the smoky liquid catching the light from the green-shaded banker's lamp on his desk. The only sounds were the clink of the decanter against the glass and the distant, muted sigh of city traffic far below. He handed one of the glasses to Julian, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. "You speak of rules being broken, Julian," the judge said, his voice calm and measured. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the legs trail slowly down the side. "A piece of advice from an old man who has seen a thing or two. For every rule that is broken, for every line that is crossed, there is always a consequence. It is as inevitable as gravity." He wasn't raising his voice. It was a statement of fact, offered with the quiet authority of a man who had personally delivered those consequences for 4 decades. It was a warning, but it was also an olive branch, a lesson from his world to Julian's. Julian took a slow sip of the scotch, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't looking at the books with respect, but with a kind of detached anthropological curiosity, as if observing the artifacts of a lost civilization. A faint, ironic smile played on his lips. He let the silence stretch for a moment, enjoying the weight of it, before he finally met the judge's gaze. "Consequences," Julian said. "The word, soft but sharp, are for the little people, for those who get caught." He took another sip, his confidence so absolute it was almost a physical force in the room. He gestured with his glass, a sweeping motion that took in the thousands of pages of legal precedents surrounding them. "This is all very impressive, truly, a monument to a certain way of thinking. I think still," he placed his glass on the coaster on the judge's mahogany desk, "a small act of territorial aggression." Then he looked the judge straight in the eye, his smile vanishing, replaced by an expression of startling intensity. "With all due respect, Judge," he began, and the perfunctory politeness of the phrase only made the words that followed more brutal. "Your kind of power is fading. It's symbolic. It's about interpreting rules that were written 100 years ago. My kind of power is tangible. It's real. It moves markets in milliseconds. It builds empires out of code. It changes the way the world actually works, not just how we talk about it." The intellectual tension in the room thickened, becoming something suffocating. The judge stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of judicial neutrality. But he could feel Olivia beside him. She had frozen, her hand clutching her wine glass so tightly he worried it might shatter. Julian took a step closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial, almost pitying tone. "You see, you spend your life guarding the kingdom. You maintain the walls. You polish the crown. You interpret the ancient scrolls. We, my generation, were not interested in the walls. We are the new kings." The declaration landed with the force of a thrown gauntlet. It was brazen, a breathtaking act of patristical ambition. This was no longer a family disagreement over a glass of whiskey. It was a coup, staged in the very seat of the old king's power. "Julian," Olivia's voice was a choked whisper. As a lawyer, she had been raised to revere the very system her husband was now gleefully dismantling. To her, this wasn't just disrespect, it was blasphemy. "That's not what you mean. You can't possibly." "Oh, but I do, darling," Julian said, not even glancing at her. His focus was entirely on her father, on the man he saw as a relic. "I mean, every word of it. The world belongs to the creators now, not the curators." The judge finally moved. He very deliberately set his untouched glass of Lagavulin down on the desk beside Julian's. The sound was a sharp, definitive click that cut through the charged atmosphere. When he spoke, all warmth, all paternal concern had been stripped from his voice. What was left was cold, hard, and absolute. "Every king, Julian," he said, his voice as sharp and lethal as a shard of ice, "eventually faces a judgment. It might not be in the courtroom, and I might not be the one to deliver it, but it will come. Remember that." It was the final warning, the last word from a world Julian believed he had transcended. Julian's response was not to argue, not to defend. He simply smiled. It was a sneer, really a flicker of contempt and amusement. The judge's solemn prophecy, the bedrock principle of his entire universe, had bounced off Julian's impenetrable armor of self-belief without leaving so much as a scratch. In his eyes, the old king wasn't pronouncing a universal truth. He was just making noise, a final, irrelevant roar before the tide of the future washed him away for good. The sneer on Julian's face lingered, a mask of contemptuous victory. He was the new king, and this was his coronation. He reached for the bottle of Lagavulin on the judge's desk, intending to pour himself a conqueror's share. The library, with its silent, leather-bound witnesses, was no longer a fortress of the old guard. It was the first captured territory of his new empire. But as his fingers closed around the neck of the bottle, another hand, wrinkled but unyielding, closed over his. Judge Sterling hadn't moved with speed, but with a final, implacable authority. Their eyes met over the decanter. "I think you've had enough, Julian," the judge said. His voice was quiet, devoid of anger. It was the voice he used when informing a defendant that their time for arguments had expired. The evening is over. It was such a simple act. A father-in-law, in his own home, deciding the night had come to a close. A host reclaiming his space. But to Julian, it was the ultimate negation. It was the old world. The world of rules and limits and consequences he had just declared obsolete, trying to reassert its pathetic control over him. It was a peasant telling the king he could not have another drink in his own castle. The fragile veneer of Julian's civilized charm didn't just crack, it vaporized. A dark, primal rage flooded his features, twisting his handsome face into something ugly and unrecognizable. "Over when I say it's over," he snarled, yanking the bottle from the judge's grasp with a sudden, violent jerk. The whiskey sloshed, a dark amber wave against the crystal. The air crackled, the intellectual debate collapsing into a raw, animalistic struggle for dominance. "You're finished, old man." Julian's voice was a ragged shout now, echoing off the silent law books. "Your rules don't apply anymore. This is my world. I have all the power now." To punctuate the declaration, he did not drink from his glass. He brandished it like a weapon, and then he threw it. Time seemed to warp, to stretch, and slow down. The heavy crystal tumbler cartwheeled through the air, a deadly, glittering projectile. It wasn't aimed to kill, but to desecrate, to prove a point. It flew past the judge's shoulder, close enough for him to feel the rush of air, and grazed his temple before it met its final destination. The sound was a sickening punctuation to his shout. A sharp crack as the glass struck his head, followed by an explosive shatter as it hit the bookshelf behind him. It ripped through the spine of a leather-bound volume Mayhew on constitutional law before raining shards of crystal onto the floor. The remaining whiskey splashed across the books, dark stains blooming on the dry, ancient paper like fresh blood. Then there was silence, a profound, ringing silence, broken only by the faint, almost delicate drip of whiskey onto the Persian rug. Julian stood panting, his chest heaving, his face a mask of shock. The rage had evaporated as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a dawning, wide-eyed horror. He stared at his own hand, the one that had thrown the glass, as if it belonged to a stranger. He looked at the judge, at the thin, almost elegant line of red that was now trickling from his temple, down his cheek, and dripping onto the crisp white collar of his shirt. Judge Sterling did not flinch. He did not cry out. He simply stood there, a statue of quiet dignity, the single drop of blood a stark verdict against the man who had assaulted him. He was no longer a father-in-law, he was a victim. And the library was no longer a library. It was a crime scene. But the most shocking thing in that frozen tableau was Olivia. She didn't scream. She didn't rush to her father's side to check the wound. She didn't turn on her husband with tears and recriminations. Instead, she took one deliberate step backward, creating a space of clear, cold separation from the two men. Her face, which had been a canvas of pained indecision, was now perfectly, terrifyingly blank. The wife had left the room. The lawyer had entered. She pulled her iPhone from her clutch. Her movements were fluid and economical, betraying no panic, only purpose. Julian saw her, and a new kind of fear, a confusion far deeper than the shock of his own violence, flickered in his eyes. "Liv?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing?" She didn't look at him. Her thumb was already swiping across the screen, her gaze fixed on her contacts. She found the name she was looking for and pressed the call button. She raised the phone to her ear, And when she spoke, her voice was as calm and clear as if she were ordering a coffee. "Hello, Mark. Is Olivia Sterling." A pause. Julian stared, his mouth slightly agape, unable to process what was happening. His wife, his beautiful, adoring wife, was making a phone call. "I'm sorry to call you at home," she continued, her tone even and professional. "But I need to report an assault." Julian's blood ran cold. "Yes, right now, at my father's residence." She finally lifted her head, and her eyes, the eyes he had fallen in love with, that he thought he owned locked onto his, they were utterly devoid of warmth, of love, of anything but a chilling, clinical assessment. "The perpetrator is my husband, Julian Croft." She held his gaze as she listened to the voice on the other end, her expression unwavering. The family alliance hadn't just been broken. She had personally, methodically, and irrevocably severed it. As she ended the call, she lowered the phone, her stare never leaving his face. Julian looked from his wife, the prosecutor, to her father, the silent victim, who was now looking at his daughter with an expression of profound, absolute, and heartbreaking pride. The new king was in the kingdom, but judgment had arrived far sooner than he ever could have imagined. The 15 minutes between Olivia's phone call and the inevitable arrival of the police unfolded in a strange, distorted reality. Time stretched and compressed. The library, a moment ago a battleground, was now a vacuum-sealed chamber of shock. Julian had collapsed into a leather armchair, a king abruptly deposed, looking small and pathetic in his Tom Ford suit. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared at the shards of glass on the floor as if they were the shattered pieces of his own life, which, of course, they were. The only sounds were the faint, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall and the insistent drip, drip, drip of expensive scotch soaking into a $1,000 rug. Olivia finally let out a shuddering breath, the first crack in her icy composure. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind the raw, trembling tissues of trauma. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-preservation. "Dad," she whispered, her voice still hoarse with disbelief. I can't believe he did that." She expected him to come to her then, to wrap her in a hug, to offer the paternal comfort she suddenly craved like oxygen. But Judge Sterling did not move toward her. His gaze was fixed on the file he had been building, a case he had been preparing for in secret. He was no longer just her father. He was counsel, and this was discovery. He walked not to his daughter, but to a locked cabinet built seamlessly into the oak paneling. He produced a small, brass key, turned the lock, and retrieved a thin, unassuming manila folder. He placed it on the polished mahogany desk between them, a quiet, definitive thud that felt louder than the shattered glass. "Belief isn't required when you have evidence, Olivia," he said, his voice devoid of sentiment. It was the voice of a judge, not a father. "I've had my suspicions for months." His arrogance was becoming careless. He opened the file. It wasn't thick, but it was dense with meaning. The contents were laid out with the cold, irrefutable logic of a legal brief. On top were credit card statements not for their joint account, but for a corporate card Julian controlled. Olivia's eyes, trained to scan documents for anomalies, immediately caught them. A charge for $2,000 at Cartier in Chicago. On a Tuesday, he was supposedly in meetings in Boston. A series of receipts from a restaurant in Soho she had never heard of. Always for two, always late at night. Beneath the statements were printouts of flight itineraries. A weekend trip to Street Bards, booked for two, under a corporate expense code. She felt a wave of nausea. He had told her he was at a tech conference in Austin that weekend. He even brought her back a souvenir t-shirt. "This isn't about a glass of whiskey, Olivia," her father said softly, pushing a hotel receipt toward her. It was from the Peninsula Beverly Hills, for a bungalow suite, booked for a Mr. and Mrs. Julian Croft. The dates coincided with a solo trip he'd taken to meet with venture capitalists. She remembered the call she'd made to the room, how a woman had answered before quickly hanging up. He told her it must have been the hotel operator, across line. Her mind, the sharp, analytical mind of a lawyer, began to connect the data points, assembling them into a picture of blatant, Systemic betrayal. The professional outrage began to cauterize the personal pain. He believes he is above every rule, the judge continued, his voice a low, steady current of truth. The rules of the market, the rules of society. He paused, letting his final point land with devastating weight. And the ones we made to each other in this family, he wasn't just breaking the law by misusing investor funds, Olivia. He was breaking his vows. Julian made a small, wounded sound from the chair, a pathetic whimper of dissent. But he offered no defense. He couldn't. His silence was the most damning confession of all. Olivia looked at the evidence, then at her husband, then back at the evidence. The violent, enraged man who had thrown a glass at her father was not an aberration. He was the real Julian, stripped of his charismatic disguise. The attack wasn't a spontaneous mistake. It was the inevitable eruption of a character rotten with deceit. The glass was just the tip of an iceberg of lies, an iceberg that had just ripped a fatal hole in the hull of her marriage. From the street below, a new sound began to intrude upon the silence. A faint, distant wail, rising and falling. A siren, getting closer. The sound seemed to galvanize Olivia. The period of shock was over. The trial was complete. Now came the sentencing. She turned away from the two men, walked over to a side table, and opened her laptop. The gentle chime of the startup screen filled the room. Julian looked up, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. Was she going to email his lawyer? Try to undo what she had done? She opened a blank document. The siren was louder now, a piercing cry just a few blocks away. Her fingers, steady and sure, flew across the keyboard. She wasn't drafting a statement. She wasn't taking notes. She was writing the end. At the top of the page, in stark black letters, she typed, Superior Court of the State of New York, County of New York, petition for dissolution of marriage. The police were coming for his freedom. His wife was coming for the rest. The doorbell chimed. It wasn't the soft, melodic tone reserved for guests, but a sharp, insistent buzz from the lobby security desk. It was a sound that didn't belong in the hushed opulence of the penthouse. It was the sound of the outside world, the world of rules and consequences, demanding entry. Two uniformed NYPD officers stood in the marble entryway, their presence so jarringly official it seemed to suck all the air from the room. They were young, stoic, their faces impassive. Their radios crackled softly, a mundane broadcast from a reality Julian had believed he was immune to. Outside, through the vast windows, the night was alive with strobing red and blue lights, the colors of emergency and order washing over the Cristofo silverware and the minimalist Italian furniture, rendering it all a surreal and garish stage. One of the officers, the senior of the two, stepped forward. Julian Croft? Julian, who had remained slumped in his chair, a man made of straw, looked up. He seemed unable to form a word. He just nodded, a pathetic, jerky motion. Mr. Croft, the officer said, his voice a flat, procedural monotone that offered no room for negotiation. You are under arrest for felony assault. The words, so stark and so final, finally seemed to pierce through Julian's shock. He looked at Olivia, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror. This had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding, a piece of theater his wife would now end. He was Julian Croft. People like him didn't get arrested. People like him made phone calls and fixed things. Liv. He breathed, his voice cracking. Please, Liv, don't do this. Olivia didn't look at him. She looked at the officer. Her voice was steady, her demeanor disturbingly calm. Officer, before you take him, may I have one moment? In our bedroom. The officer assessed her for a beat, this poised, elegant woman in the expensive black dress who had just had her husband arrested. He gave a curt nod. 1 minute. Olivia turned and walked down the hallway, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Julian watched her go, a sliver of insane hope flickering within him. Maybe she was getting her purse, her car keys. Maybe she was coming with him to the station, to post bail, to smooth this all over with their high-powered lawyers. She returned less than a minute later, her hands empty, her face as serene and unreadable as before. The printer in the library was still warm. The single sheet of paper she had placed on his pillow was still settling into the fibers of the Egyptian cotton. It was a symbolic, devastating final move. She had taken their most intimate space, the bed they had shared, the place of secrets and dreams and promises, and turned it into the definitive scene of their ending. The officers moved in. Julian instinctively recoiled as they reached for his arms, pulling them behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists was the loudest sound in the world. He, who had spoken of breaking rules and forging new eras, was now bound by a simple, ancient instrument of consequence. The king was in chains. As the officers led him toward the door, a broken man in a bespoke suit, Judge Sterling spoke a single sentence, not to Julian, but to the room, to the universe itself, as if closing a case file that had been open for far too long. Judgment is rendered. Julian's head snapped up at the words. He looked from the cold, unforgiving face of his father-in-law to the calm, distant face of his wife. And in that moment, the full, catastrophic scope of his ruin finally crashed down upon him. It wasn't the looming threat of a jail cell that made a raw, guttural scream tear from his throat. It wasn't the public humiliation or the financial fallout. It was the chilling, absolute finality of it all. It was the divorce papers on his pillow. It was the realization that, in the space of a single glass of whiskey, he had lost everything that mattered: his freedom, his empire, and the woman who had just delivered the checkmate. The heavy penthouse door closed behind them, muffling his scream. The apartment plunged back into a thick, ringing silence. The flashing lights outside dwindled as the patrol car pulled away, leaving only the steady, indifferent glow of the city. The storm had passed. Olivia walked slowly to the great window, her bare arms wrapped around herself. Her father came to stand beside her, not touching, but present. They stood there for a long time, two silent figures against the glittering skyline. The first, pale fingers of dawn were beginning to stretch across the East River, promising a new day. They watched the sun rise over the city, not with triumph, not with gloating, but with the profound, weary, and serene stillness of survivors who had weathered a terrible war and lived to see the morning. The morning after was a study in surreal quiet. In the judge's library, the shattered glass had been swept away and the stained law books removed, leaving a conspicuous gap on the shelf, like a missing tooth. The air, however, still felt charged, thick with the memory of violence. Olivia hadn't slept. She had sat in that same library, her laptop open, channeling the raw adrenaline of shock and betrayal into the cold, precise language of legal petitions. The tears were gone, replaced by a steely, unfamiliar resolve. She was no longer just the victim, she was the plaintiff. By 10 a.m., Julian was out on bail. The news of his arrest had already slithered through the rarefied corridors of Wall Street. A salacious whisper passed between trading desks and over-expensive lunches. Did you hear about Julian Croft? Some kind of domestic spat at his father-in-law's place, the judge. Reputations, like markets, could collapse in an instant. Julian's first move was predictable. He didn't call Olivia. He called Marcus Thorne. Thorne was the kind of lawyer whose name was uttered in the same hushed, reverent tones as the top surgeons. His offices were a minimalist expanse of glass and chrome in a midtown skyscraper, a space designed to communicate that any problem, no matter how messy, could be managed, sanitized, and solved for a price. Julian sat across a vast marble desk from Thorne, looking diminished but defiant. He was a man who still believed this was, at its core, a negotiation. It was a family argument that got out of hand. Julian insisted, his voice raspy. The judge, he's old school, overbearing. He's always resented my success. Marcus Thorne, a man with silver hair and a cobra's calm, listened patiently. He had seen this 100 times. Powerful men who believed their own narratives so completely they couldn't fathom a world where those narratives failed them. The assault charge is problematic, Julian. The divorce petition filed so swiftly is even more so. It looks premeditated on her part, which we can use, but it also signals she isn't going to be reasonable. Thorne's strategy was classic and brutal. They would not fight the facts of the night. They would rewrite the story around them. They would paint Julian not as an aggressor, but as the passionate, misunderstood victim of a controlling, vindictive father-in-law, a man using his powerful daughter to settle an old score. The first step was to seize control of the public narrative. By late afternoon, Marcus Thorne stood before a bank of microphones in his firm's lobby, the picture of measured concern. Olivia and the judge watched the press conference on the cable news network from the library, their newly established war room. My client, Mr. Croft, deeply regrets the emotional escalation of what was a private family matter, Thorne said, his voice smooth as silk. He has immense respect for his father-in-law, Judge Sterling. We are confident that once all the facts are presented, this will be revealed as a tragic misunderstanding, perhaps fueled by the pressures of generational differences. We intend to resolve this privately and swiftly. Olivia felt a hot surge of rage. Generational differences? He made it sound like they'd had a disagreement over what to watch on television. He's painting Dad as some kind of tyrant, and me as his puppet, she said, pacing in front of the screen. The nerve of that man. Annexation. Judge Sterling, however, remained perfectly calm. He watched Thorne's polished performance with the detached interest of a biologist observing a specimen. He didn't react. He analyzed. When the broadcast ended, he simply turned off the television. Good, he said quietly. Good? Olivia spun around. Dad, they're slandering you. Arrogance makes people predictable. Olivia, he said, his eyes clear and focused. They believe they are playing chess when they are merely knocking over the pieces. Let them. The next move in their game arrived a day later, delivered by a grim-faced courier. It was a thick packet of legal documents, a formal response to Olivia's divorce petition. But buried within the boilerplate was a tactical strike, a demand designed to inflict maximum personal damage, a motion to compel full financial disclosure from both Olivia and her father. Olivia's hands trembled slightly as she read it. It was a vicious, calculated insinuation that Judge Sterling was financially controlling his daughter, that his wealth was the invisible string pulling her, and that this entire affair, the assault charge, the divorce, was a power play rooted in money. It was an attempt to drag the judge's sterling reputation through the mud. He's trying to make you the villain, she said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and fury. For the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt. This was going to be ugly, a war of attrition fought in the tabloids and the court of public opinion. She looked at her father, worried that Julian had finally found a weapon that could hurt him. The judge took the document from her. He read the motion, his expression unreadable. He walked over to the window, looking out over the city as the afternoon sun glinted off the distant towers. Julian and his expensive lawyer thought they were launching a brilliant counteroffensive. They thought they were prying into his finances, looking for leverage. They had no idea what they were really asking for. Slowly, a smile touched the corners of the judge's mouth. It was a cold, thin, utterly terrifying smile. The smile of a grandmaster who has just watched his opponent make the one move that guarantees his destruction. He turned back to his daughter, the legal papers held loosely in his hand. He thinks he's asking for a financial statement, he said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. He's actually asking for the rope to hang himself. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? Julian, buoyed by Marcus Thorne's slick media performance, was likely sleeping the sound, untroubled sleep of the pathologically arrogant. He believed he had weathered the initial storm and turned the battle to his preferred terrain, a public relations war where truth was malleable and the best narrative won. He had no idea that while he slept, the real war was being planned and executed from a quiet, book-lined room overlooking Central Park. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the judge's library was no longer a sanctuary of wisdom or the scene of a crime. It had become a command center, a sterile and silent space dedicated to a single, intricate purpose. The only light came from the green glow of the banker's lamp on the desk, illuminating a landscape of neatly organized documents, bank statements, wire transfer receipts, corporate credit card bills, and hotel folios. This was the arsenal. Olivia and her father worked with a quiet, synchronized intensity that felt more corporate than familial. The raw, ragged emotion of the previous nights had been burned away, leaving behind the cold, hard wiring of their legal training. Olivia hunched over her laptop, cross-referenced digital footprints, with the paper trail spread before her. Her father sat opposite, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his long, elegant fingers sorting the documents into two identical piles. Here, Olivia murmured, her voice a low hum in the silent room. She pointed to a line item on a corporate Amex statement. A charge for a private villa at the Cheval Blanc in Street Barts. Expense under client relations and development. She clicked her mouse a few times, pulling up a new window on her screen. It was a brightly lit Instagram profile belonging to a woman, a model, an influencer. Olivia wasn't sure, posing on a balcony, a turquoise sea behind her. The caption read, "Paradise with my king for a week." The dates of her posts matched the hotel charges exactly. She's not a client, Dad. I've cross-referenced her name against every fund document. She doesn't exist in his professional world. Judge Sterling nodded, his expression grimly satisfied. He took the printout of the Instagram post and placed it neatly on top of the corresponding hotel receipt. "We don't make accusations, Olivia," he said, his voice even and precise. "We present data points. A trip expense to the company's client relations budget. A wire transfer from a restricted investor fund to a personal account that then paid for a down payment on a Porsche. A pattern of lavish expenditures that have no discernible business purpose. We simply arrange the facts in a logical sequence. Let them draw their own conclusions." He paused, his gaze meeting hers over the lamplight. The conclusions of a federal prosecutor. They worked like this for hours. A father's seasoned wisdom combining with a daughter's digital acuity. They were a perfect, dispassionate unit, their shared grief and anger sublimated into the creation of two perfectly curated dossiers of evidence. They weren't writing a story of marital betrayal. That was a separate, private pain. They were assembling a case of wire fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. They decided on two targets. Attacking Julian directly was now a messy, public affair. But Julian's power, his kingdom, rested on two pillars: the compliance of the institutions that regulated him, and the confidence of the people who empowered him. The first package was for the regulator, a thick 9 by 12 envelope addressed to the attention of the Director, Division of Enforcement at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, D.C. The second was for the internal power structure. It was addressed to David Chen, the lead independent director on the board of Julian's fund, a man known for his rigid ethics and low tolerance for scandal. They didn't write a cover letter. There was no vengeful note, no hint of the personal drama that had unearthed this information. Emotion was a weakness. Anonymity was a shield. The documents, highlighted in places with a yellow marker, were meant to speak for themselves in the cold, unambiguous language of numbers and dates. Just before dawn, as the sky over Manhattan began to soften from black to a bruised purple, Olivia made a call. 20 minutes later, a man in a plain, unbranded uniform arrived at the service entrance. He was from a private, bonded courier service that specialized in discretion, the kind used by law firms to serve sensitive documents. He took the two identical, heavily sealed packages. There was no return address. The transaction was paid for in cash. There will be no trace connecting the penthouse on Central Park South to the financial and legal earthquake they were about to trigger. As the first rays of sunlight struck the top of the Time Warner Center, father and daughter stood in the library, drinking coffee from delicate porcelain cups. The room was tidy again, the files locked away. The battle was no longer in their hands. They had launched the missiles, and now all they could do was wait for them to land. The judge looked at his daughter, her face pale but resolute in the morning light. She has survived. She will be okay. He turned his gaze to the window, to the waking city below. "Now," he said, his voice a low murmur, "we wait for the dominoes to fall." For 3 days, Julian inhabited a state of suspended animation. The world had split into two distinct realities. In one, the public one curated by Marcus Thorne, he was the aggrieved party in a messy but ultimately manageable family dispute. The narrative was taking hold. He saw the sympathetic murmurs in the financial gossip columns, the carefully planned quotes from sources close to the situation who described Judge Sterling as a man from a bygone era, unable to cope with his son-in-law's more dynamic, modern form of success. Julian started to believe it himself. He went to his office, took calls, and projected an aura of unruffled confidence. He was weathering the storm. The second reality was the cold, silent truth of his empty apartment. The divorce petition sitting on his nightstand where Olivia's picture used to be, and the nagging, subterranean fear of the pending assault charge. But he was a master at compartmentalizing. The legal issue was a nuisance, but it was containable. His kingdom, the fund, was secure. That was the source of his true power. And it was untouched. So when the email arrived from Arthur Chen, the venerable chairman of his fund's board, requesting his presence at an emergency meeting, Julian felt a spike of annoyance, not dread. He assumed, with the easy confidence of a man who had never truly faced professional consequences, that the board was getting skittish about the bad press. They were old men, cautious by nature. They needed to be managed, their fears assuaged. He spent the morning preparing a series of talking points, a blend of humble apology for the public distraction and firm reassurance that all was under control. He would be charming, decisive, and masterful. He would remind them who was the king. He rode a private elevator to the top floor of the skyscraper, the home of the boardroom. This was his domain, a place he associated with victory and validation. The doors opened onto a silent, marble-floored reception area. Chen's executive assistant, a woman who usually greeted him with a warm, deferential smile, simply nodded, her eyes avoiding his. It was the first discordant note in his symphony of self-assurance. He pushed open heavy, soundproof doors to the boardroom and stepped inside. And the world stopped. The air was frigid, all the warmth and collegiality sucked out of the space. The long, gleaming mahogany table, usually a site of strategic collaboration, felt like a slab in the morgue. Around it sat the four other members of the board, Arthur Chen, David Kellerman, Robert Pruitt, and Michael Singh. These were men he knew well, men he had made millions for, men he had golfed with and shared expensive dinners with. Today, they looked like strangers. Their faces were stony, impassive masks of corporate gravity. There were no smiles. No one stood to greet him. A single, bound document sat at each man's place setting. Julian's confident greeting died in his throat. A cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. He slowly took his seat at the head of the table, his throne, but today it felt like the defendant's chair. Arthur Chen, a man whose quiet demeanor belied a legendary ruthlessness, did not waste time with pleasantries. He slid one of the bound documents across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of Julian. "Julian," Chen said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. "We received this anonymous package yesterday afternoon." Julian looked down. It was a dossier, professionally bound in black. He opened it with trembling fingers. The first page was a copy of the hotel folio from the Peninsula Beverly Hills for the bungalow suite, under his name. The next page was a printout of the wire transfer he had made from the Phoenix Fund's operating account to his personal slush fund. Page after page, it was all there. The street, Bart's trip, the Cartier charge, the Patek Philippe watch he'd bought for the influencer, all laid out next to company expense reports that listed them as client meetings or investor development. It was his secret life, meticulously documented and cross-referenced. "We've had our forensic accountants verify the data overnight," Chen continued, his voice as cold and hard as the glass walls of the room. "The findings are incontrovertible. Explain the wire transfer from the Phoenix Fund, Julian. Explain the street Bart's villa." The blood drained from Julian's face. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, the floor dropping out from under him. This wasn't about the fight. It wasn't about the judge. This was an extinction-level event. His mind raced, desperately searching for a narrative, a defense, an escape route. He fell back on the only one he had. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive silence. "It's a fabrication. It's slander. This has my father-in-law's fingerprints all over it. He's a bitter old man trying to ruin me." Arthur Chen slowly shook his head, a gesture not of sympathy, but of finality. This has nothing to do with your father-in-law, Julian. We don't care about your family drama. This has to do with fiduciary duty. It has to do with the charter of this fund and the trust of our investors. It has to do with wire fraud. The words hung in the air, deadly and absolute. Julian looked at the other faces around the table, searching for an ally, a flicker of doubt, a lifeline. He found nothing. Their eyes were cold. In the brutal calculus of their world, he had ceased to be an asset. He had become a liability, a contagion. And the only response to a contagion is to quarantine and eradicate it. Chen slid another single piece of paper across the table. It was a resignation letter. You have two options, the chairman said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. Option 1, you sign this letter of resignation, effective immediately, citing personal reasons. We will issue a press release and you will walk out of this building today. Option 2, you refuse, and we hand this entire file, along with our own internal findings, to the district attorney's office this afternoon. He paused, letting the weight of the ultimatum crush what was left of Julian's composure. Your choice. It wasn't a choice. It was a death sentence, with the option of a quiet burial or public execution. Julian stared at the letter. The articulate, powerful, charming man was gone. In his place was a cornered animal, trembling and exposed. His entire world, the power, the prestige, the kingdom he had boasted of, had been dismantled in under 5 minutes. He picked up the pen. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely form the letters of his own name. He signed his application. The meeting was over. 2 security guards were waiting for him outside the boardroom. They escorted him to his office, with its panoramic view of the charging bull and the harbor beyond. His keycard no longer worked. One of the guards unlocked it for him. He was given a small cardboard box and told he had 5 minutes. What do you take with you when your life evaporates? He numbly packed a framed photo of him and Olivia on their honeymoon in Italy, a heavy crystal deal toy from his first big success, a silver pen set. The box was mostly empty. The office already felt like it belonged to someone else. The guards escorted him to the elevator. They didn't ride down with him. They sent him down alone. A final, quiet act of banishment. As the elevator descended, he caught his reflection in the polished steel walls, a pale, hollowed-out man clutching a pathetic cardboard box. He knew what would be waiting for him in the lobby. The board wouldn't leave things to chance. They would have tipped off the press to control the narrative. As the doors opened, he was hit by a blinding barrage of flashing lights. A swarm of financial reporters, the same people who had once hung on his every word about market trends, now lunged at him like a pack of wolves, shouting questions. Julian, is it true you've resigned? Is there a federal investigation? Mr. Croft, what are the personal reasons? He said nothing. He lowered his head and pushed through the scrum, a parade of one, the flashes illuminating the utter, soul-crushing humiliation on his face. He stumbled out onto the sidewalk on Wall Street, the sounds of the city a deafening roar. The reporters, having gotten their shot of the fallen king, dispersed as quickly as they had appeared. Julian stood there for a moment, disoriented, clutching his small box of memories. He looked up at the gleaming, impossibly tall skyscraper he had just been ejected from. His name was already being scrubbed from the digital directory in the lobby. His kingdom was gone. His queen had left him. His freedom was a ticking clock. He had lost everything. And in the terrifying, empty abyss that had just opened up in his life, a new, dangerous thought began to form. When you have nothing left to lose, revenge is the only asset you have left. Julian Croft, the man who once commanded boardrooms and moved markets with a single phone call, was now a ghost haunting the canyons of Manhattan. His name, once a synonym for audacious success, was now a toxic asset. The board had been swift and merciless, but the anonymous package to the SEC had landed with the force of a bunker-busting bomb. An official notice of investigation had arrived, a document whose bland, bureaucratic language spelled out the utter ruin of his professional life. His assets were frozen, his reputation radioactive. Marcus Thorne, his high-priced legal cobra, now spoke to him in clipped, cautious tones, the sound of a man distancing himself from a client who was no longer just in trouble, but was sinking. In the wreckage of his life, with the walls of a federal indictment closing in, Julian did the one thing he had left to do. He made the call he should have made first, the call that was his last, desperate, pathetic gamble. He called Olivia. He expected her to hang up. He expected a cold refusal from her lawyer. He was, therefore, stunned when she answered, her voice impossibly calm, as if he were a distant acquaintance calling to confirm a lunch reservation. He began to plead a torrent of desperate, disjointed sentences about misunderstandings, about her father's vendetta, about the life they had built. "I need to see you, Liv," he finished, his voice a ragged whisper. "Please, just once, to talk." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Olivia, in her father's quiet library, looked at the phone, then at her father, who gave her a single, steady nod. She had to know. For her own sake, she had to hear the final truth from his own lips. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice betraying nothing. 2 o'clock. "There's a coffee shop on Bleecker Street, the Daily Grind. I'll be there." She said the terms. A neutral space, a public space, a place where a king, even a deposed one, could not rage. The Daily Grind was a world away from the gilded cage they had once shared. It was noisy, crowded, and smelled of burnt coffee and steamed milk. Students hunched over laptops, and the hiss of the espresso machine provided a constant, percussive backdrop. Olivia was already there when Julian arrived, sitting at a small, scarred wooden table in the corner. She wore simple jeans and a gray sweater, looking more like the law student she had once been than the wife of a titan. Julian looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His suit, once a symbol of his power, was rumpled and hung loosely on his frame. His face was pale and gaunt, dark circles blooming under his eyes. He slid into the chair opposite her, a man seeking sanctuary. "Liv," he began, his hands trembling as he reached across the table for hers. She pulled them back, placing them in her lap. The rejection was quiet but absolute. "Thank you for coming. I know how this looks." "How does it look, Julian?" she asked, her tone conversational, but her eyes were sharp, analytical. "It looks like your father won," he said, a flicker of the old bitterness surfacing. He pushed and he set a trap and I fell into it. But this isn't me, Liv. The SEC, the board, is a witch hunt based on lies he fed them." "He didn't feed them anything," Olivia said calmly. "He just sent them your expense reports and your wire transfers. Are you saying you didn't make them?" "You don't understand the business," he snapped, before catching himself, forcing his voice back down to a pleading register. "It's complicated. You have to move money, you have to entertain. It's how the game is played." He wouldn't understand. He leaned forward, his eyes wet with a desperate, manufactured sincerity. "Liv, you have to help me. This is all spiraling from that one night. Your father started this, you can stop it. Call the D. A, call Mark. Tell them it was an accident. Tell them you were upset and overreacted. We can fix this. You and me." Olivia took a slow sip of her tea. She placed the cup back in the saucer with a soft click. The lawyer, the one who had been dormant for so long, was now fully in control. The wife was gone. "I've been thinking a lot about that night, Julian," she said, her voice thoughtful, almost academic. "And something doesn't add up. I keep playing it over and over. Your toast, the things you said in the library, your anger. It was so personal, so volcanic." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze pinning him in place. "Why were you so angry that night?" "It was more than just the whiskey. It was more than my father telling you the evening was over." Julian shifted uncomfortably. He was being condescending. He was treating me like a child in his own house. "No," Olivia said, shaking her head slowly. "That's not it. This was different. I know you, Julian. I know your different kinds of anger. This one was specific. What did you and my father discuss before I joined you two for drinks? What did you talk about right after dinner while I was on the phone with the caterer?" It was a brilliant, targeted question. A question born from a daughter's intuition and a prosecutor's instinct. She was no longer talking about the assault. She was digging for the motive, the root cause he had so carefully concealed. He was cornered. His plan to plead and manipulate was failing, crashing against her unexpected, logical calm. His desperation curdled back into the raw, ugly rage that was his true nature. The truth, the real, poisonous truth he had been hiding, finally erupted. You want to know? He spat, his voice a low, vicious snarl that turned heads at the nearby tables. You want to know what we talked about? I'll tell you. We talked about the future, our future. He leaned across the table, his face contorted. He could have made us all rich, rich beyond your wildest dreams. I had a deal, Liv, a once-in-a-lifetime deal, an inside track on a biotech merger. All it required was a little facilitation, a little guidance from a man with his connections. But he refused. He called it unethical. He called it a crime. The words poured out of him, a confession born of pure, narcissistic fury. He had completely lost control, his voice rising with every word. That old fool chose his precious honor over his own family's future. Over your future, we could have been untouchable. And he threw it away because of some dusty old law books. That's what we were arguing about. That's why I was so angry. He deserved it. He deserved more than that, he gasped, the final damning words hanging in the air between them. He looked at Olivia's face, and in her eyes he saw not shock, not anger, but a kind of cold, quiet horror. He saw the trap. He realized, far too late, that he had just confessed not just to a motive for assault, but to conspiracy to commit insider trading. He had admitted that the violence wasn't a random act of rage, but a direct result of his father-in-law's refusal to break the law with him. Olivia's phone, which had been sitting screen down on the table between them, was now lit up, the red dot of the voice memo app glowing softly. She didn't say a word. The confession had revealed everything. It was the final, ugly piece of the puzzle. Her husband hadn't just betrayed her with other women, hadn't just lied about money, hadn't just been arrogant and violent. He had tried to corrupt her father, the one thing in her life that was built on a foundation of integrity, and had turned on him with violence when he failed. With a final, profound look of disgust, Olivia stood up. She picked up her phone, dropped a $10 bill on the table for her tea, and walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. The next scene was quieter, but infinitely more final. Olivia sat in a sterile office in the district attorney's building. Her friend Mark sat across from her, his expression grim. She didn't offer a long explanation. She simply placed her phone on his desk and pressed play. As Julian's raging, venomous confession filled the quiet room, she knew, with a certainty that was both heartbreaking and liberating, that she had finally, irrevocably closed the case. Tôi đoán 99% trong số các bạn sẽ nghe đến đây. Thở dài rồi lướt qua, không bấm like hay đăng ký. Dù chỉ mất đúng 1 giây, bây giờ là mấy giờ bên bạn và bạn đang nghe ở đâu. 6 months later, the library was quiet again. The violent echoes of that terrible night had long since faded, replaced by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the gentle rustle of newspaper. Afternoon sunlight, warm and forgiving, streamed through the windows, illuminating the space not as a crime scene, but as a sanctuary. The ghosts were gone. Olivia sat in a deep leather armchair, a book resting in her lap, watching her father complete his Sunday crossword puzzle. The silence between them was no longer a tense, watchful thing, but an easy, comfortable peace. On the television, a weekend news program murmured in the background, a low hum of distant tragedies and triumphs. Suddenly, a familiar face filled the screen, jarring the room's tranquility. It was Julian, but a version of him hollowed out and defeated, his eyes dark voids in a pale, drawn face. It was his official courthouse photograph. In business news, a crisp anchorwoman's voice announced, former hedge fund magnate Julian Croft was sentenced Friday to a term of 7 to 10 years in a federal correctional facility. Croft was found guilty on multiple counts of securities, fraud, and embezzlement, in addition to a lesser charge of felony assault. They watched without expression as the brief report concluded. When it was over, the judge picked up the remote and the screen went black. The click was quiet but definitive. The final chapter had been written, the book closed. I kept thinking about what you said that night, Olivia said softly into the stillness. About consequences. For so long, I was living in his world, a world where he genuinely believed there were none, where rules were just suggestions for other people. She looked at her father, her gaze clear and steady. I forgot what it was like to live in yours. Judge Sterling set down his paper. It's not my world, Olivia, he said gently. It's the world. The real one. Men like Julian just live in a temporary exception to the rules. An exception that always, eventually, expires. A genuine smile touched Olivia's lips. The first truly light-hearted smile she'd worn in years. It transformed her face, erasing the last shadows of strain. I know, she said, the words carrying the weight of a profound realization. I'm leaving the firm. I've accepted a position with the DA's office. The news settled in the quiet room, a declaration of a future she was choosing for herself. It's a massive pay cut, she continued, a note of joyful defiance in her voice. The office is shabby, the hours are terrible, but it feels right. It feels like coming home. Her father's face was filled with a quiet, profound pride. This was a true victory. Not Julian's downfall, but his daughter's return to herself. He stood, walked to his heavy mahogany desk, and unlocked a small drawer. From it, he took an old Mont Blanc fountain pen, its black resin body worn smooth with a lifetime of use. He came back and held it out to her. This was the pen I used to sign my first judicial oath, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It has signed judgments and warrants, opinions and orders. It's a simple tool, Olivia, for a very important job, drawing a straight line between right and wrong when the world tries to tell you it's curved. He placed the pen in her hand. Its weight felt solid, purposeful. I think it's time it had a new owner. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. She closed her fingers around the pen, a tangible link to a legacy not of power or wealth, but of integrity. This was the inheritance that mattered. They sat together as the afternoon light deepened, a father and daughter bound by a renewed and unbreakable understanding. The silence that enveloped them was peaceful, full of everything that no longer needed to be said. From the hallway, a door stood ajar, letting a bright, hopeful sliver of light spill into the room. A new beginning,